All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here with an old friend of mine, a good buddy, and a seasoned veteran in the data space. We're going to talk to a couple different people today about data for good. So we got John Ladley, author, speaker, provocateur in all kinds of good ways out there.
Mm-hmm.
He's been talking to me for a couple decades now about data,
Ooh,
and we're sitting here wondering, data for good, data. What are some good stories around data?
yeah.
Good. And I thought to myself, well, government data, knowing where all the money goes, understanding that because transparency builds trust. And I remember talking for the UN a number of years ago, and I had this epiphany that wherever you see unrest in a country, you have one thing for sure that's taking place, and that is lack of trust in the government. When people don't trust the government, bad things happen. When people do trust the government, or at least don't mistrust it actively, things tend to be pretty okay. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, way back in 2005, I did a bunch of lobbying for transparency in federal spending because I had just moved out of New Orleans and Katrina hit. And then I remember Senators Vitter and Landrieu asked for $250 billion to rebuild southern Louisiana. And I thought, these folks, the politicians in southern Louisiana and New Orleans, are pretty good at making money disappear. So we're going to need some transparency in all this. And I did this big push where I emailed tens of thousands of reporters, leaning on them to say, hey, if government or, I mean, if public sector companies via Sarbanes Oxley are required to document and publish their processes, their governance, of course, their meaningful data, financial data, et cetera. Why doesn't the government do that? And lo and behold, they did. They passed the Federal Funding
Yeah.
Accountability and Transparency Act in 2006 on September 26th, and that began the process. We're still not there, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. We still don't really know where it all goes, but I'm thinking that's a great case for data for good. But, John, what do you think?
Oh, and it's continued. Um, I think one of the first bills that Trump signed, like first or second day in office, was the Evidence-Based Act,
Hmm.
HR 4174, which forces federal agencies to provide the facilities so people can see this data that you talked about. Everything, unless it's top secret, national defense, um, plans for weapon systems, things like that.
Right.
Um, every federal agency in the United States government has to provide dashboards and scorecards on the data they collect, the data they produce, and how they do things with their money. So that continues to this day. It created a bit of a kerfluffle because it meant that government agencies had to immediately embark upon a process that many organizations take years to do, which is tighten up their data management,
Hmm.
tighten up their data governance. So literally overnight, the federal government needed hundreds of data officers, for
Hmm.
example.
Wow.
I ended up training hordes of people to manage an organization with a data mindset versus just, well, let's just do stuff, do processes and stay under budget, right?
Hmm.
The process continues to this day. We are slowly, as a society, turning into thinking about data sooner than later. And when things happen for good with data, such as transparency and government, um, that's one of those things that turn society around. A lot of other things are happening that are good. We can get into those if you want to, but definitely the government transparency is something that's showing how important it is to be able to see it now. You and I could both agree that there's some divisiveness in the political scene these days, right?
Yeah.
He said with a smile.
Yeah.
Uh, So, um, uh, and you have people waving their arms saying, this agency did that, this agency did that, and a lot of people saying things that aren't true, you know, both sides of the aisle, right? It's read on the internet and then open your mouth and embarrass yourself. Um,
Well,
um,
and that's where the transparency comes into play, right? I mean,
yeah, but you got to know how to
because
participate in it, right?
well, this is true.
You
This
know,
is true.
it's that's and you and I, you've probably talked about on your show here about data literacy, which is
Hmm.
the ability of a human being to to interpret data, look at data, communicate with data. Data doesn't lie. This number is bigger than this number. It doesn't matter whether you agree with that or not. The
Right.
data doesn't lie. That creates profound challenges to a lot of people.
Hmm.
It creates the tendency to ask the query a different way, so the numbers change, and so you get a number that's more favorable to your position. There's so we have the transparency is on its way, and we're getting there, but the human beings have to learn how to be literate with data. Right now, I don't think we're doing real well. All you have to do is watch some talking head, whether they're on the left or the right. All right, I'm just going to, I'm going to call out Fox. I'm going to call out MSNBC. They can look at the same data set. They did it during COVID, and
Hmm.
you will hear diametrically opposed positions being blabbed on the evening news from the same data set.
Right. Well, and that is an
Yeah,
issue of data literacy, and I think
yeah,
the starting point is to make the data transparent so you can see
hmm
where the money goes. I mean,
absolutely.
I
We've got
was
to have the
doing
facilities in place.
right. Well, I was doing some research, and I found a couple of graphics. I gave a talk in New York a few weeks ago about the state of journalism. I called it the death of journalism in quotes.
Hmm
And the reason being is that you do hear a lot of storylines and narratives and things that are going on that are driven by politics, and
hmm
they obfuscate or at least blur the reality on the ground. And so I asked people, who feels confident they know why gas prices spiked in 2021? No one raised their hand. I showed them a chart where you can see, zoop, it just almost doubles from
hmm
2020 into 2021, from just under $2 to actually at some point up to $5.
hmm
And no one had any idea. And then I showed them a chart that had the same line going zoop a little bit earlier. I mean, very sharp line up. And asked people if they knew what that was. They didn't. That's the Federal Reserve's balance sheet.
Yeah,
So
M1 and M2. Yeah.
starting in what March of 2020 through
hmm
September
Yeah.
2021,
Yep.
the Fed bought $120 billion of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities
Yeah.
every month,
Yeah.
which is just basically printing money. And so
Yeah.
that's where it came from, right? So
Let's.
there's
Do you have
and
15 seconds to expand on that one?
yeah, yeah,
Because
please.
because this is a really great laboratory for how this process works. And if, to the listener, whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter. This is what studying the data, you have to learn this thought process to be a citizen in a data-driven world, which is what we are right now. Okay,
Right.
so you've got correlation, M1 and M2 going up like crazy. You've
Hmm.
got prices going up. All right. The common thing is it's this president's fault. It's not this president's fault. It's okay. Those are the superficial things. Those are the things that people want to hear, and then they grab something
Hmm.
that supports that story. The science and the facts are that if you study history, when money supplies expand rapidly, prices go up. All right.
Right.
We call it the old timey economists called it inflation, but they meant expansion of the money, not prices going up. Nowadays, when we say inflation, we mean prices going up. But in the old days, it meant just more money chasing around the same stuff. Okay,
Hmm.
and it is an absolute scientific fact that if
Right.
you jam a few trillion dollars into an economy, prices are going to go up. And it's that simple. Here it is. It's that simple. If you want to get heartburn over that, well, that's your political position.
Right.
But for you to take that number and then blame other things and make some illogical conclusion about that and say it's X person's fault or it's this party or it's that party, that's just fitting the data to your narrative, and that's
Mm-hmm.
data illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our next step from this transparency stuff. And we're learning it with this governance stuff, but I think we could probably apply it to a lot of other things too. Thank you for letting me get into that sidebar because it's a great lab on how this process works.
Well, right. And, you know, I mean, it affects everybody. So this move, and, what really concerned me is I looked up there's a chart you can find on the Fed's balance sheet where from like 2006, I think, all the way to the present day, you see this little jump in 2008, and that little jump was the huge catastrophe in the markets
Mhm.
when the
Yeah.
Fed stepped in and there was some $700 billion bill or something they passed to create some more liquidity for the markets. But the point is,
Yeah.
it's a small blip compared to the COVID area. And in between those two, it's
Hmm.
gradually going up and up and up. And that's called quantitative easing, which is
Hmm.
another way of saying printing a bunch of money,
It's
right? Where,
yeah. It's a fancy word for something that people read in their history books that is a bad thing to do, which is print money. But it's a fancy word for printing money.
right,
Absolutely.
right,
Okay.
right.
And again,
Quantitative easing.
quantitative easing. It makes it sound good.
QE3. It's just
Hey, it's
QE3.
it's August. I live in Europe. I got to take a month off because I need some quantitative easing here. I mean, it sounds like I'm gonna go on vacation or something
It
sometime.
does
But that's
sound
a
like
good
it.
example of data in our world, right? I mean, we there's data everywhere. I don't know what's the number now, 29 exabytes a minute or a second or a day. I don't. It's irrelevant anymore, right? But what we do with it is the big thing with society. I'm working on several books right now, and one of them goes into deep detail that data is anthropological. It
Mm,
it it is it is as much of an impact on humanity and society as going from gathering to farming, from farming to the Bronze Age, from the Bronze Age to the Industrial Revolution. And now it's not just we have more data and that's just a part of our lives. This is altering ourselves, and what we're talking about here is just a tiny microcosm
yeah,
of that. It's a tiny. It's not a microcosm. It's a tiny slice of that.
right. Right. And I think that better transparency into where the money goes is going to help us all and better data literacy and financial literacy. I
If
mean,
we train ourselves to read what we can see now,
right,
okay,
right.
the onus is on us too. I think
That this is
on
true.
that.
So let me ask you, I don't know how deep you can go on the topic, but mortgage-backed securities, for example. This got us in trouble back in 2008, right? When that whole
Hmm.
collapse took place because prices went up, people couldn't afford their mortgages, they walked away from their mortgage loans, and that at scale caused tremendous liquidity problems for the banks, which then got bailed out by the feds. And there's, a lot of money being loaned and thrown around there. But now to see that much in terms of mortgage-backed securities, so I mean, basically, it's a security that is a backstop for mortgage loans writ large, is kind of
Hmm.
how it works. And the idea is that it's a security, meaning you can make money on it because people are going to pay their mortgages. But if they don't pay their mortgages, of course, that's when it can go south again. But I
Hmm.
started thinking to myself, that's a whole lot of money to be throwing into MBS in the marketplace. And at what point do you just accept that the government kind of owns those homes? I mean, you own your home, but really the bank owns your home, but really the mortgage-backed security owns the loan that you are paying on. I mean, it gets pretty complex there, but at a certain
Yeah.
point, what's really going on here?
Well,
That's my question.
again, we have to train ourselves, and we can wander into this, and I will follow your lead, my esteemed host and producer. But I will. We can wander into what's the responsibility of somebody to understand this? Well, how do we learn this stuff? Well, should the school systems teach data literacy now? I kind of think so. All right.
Right.
Um, uh, all we hear on the evening news about mortgage-backed securities or something someone, person A listens to it on the evening news. Person B reads it in Forbes or Bloomberg or something like that. Person C goes real deep and maybe reads a book about it or something like that. Um, Person A, B, and C are all going to react differently because they
Hmm.
understand it at different levels. They have a different context, a different view. All right. And now, if that information is coming from a source of quote unquote news, and I use that word really loosely these days, from someone like one of the cable networks that have very firm political positions and weave it in and out of everything they say. All right, they're not journalism, but people think they're listening to news. So that's their view is going to be, oh, this is terrible, terrible, more rich, richer, and all this kind of stuff. The other people are going to have a different view and a different response to that. At one point, does society say, this is what you need to know? I mean, at one point in time, society made a conscious decision that everyone had to learn to read, Eric.
Yeah.
And when that happened, which is sometime in the 18th century, it was controversial. I mean, there
Right.
were big articles in the London papers about people. The guy on a farm doesn't have to read. Are you kidding me? That's against God's will, or something, something like that. We're in that boat again. That's where
Right.
we are. And a mortgage-backed security is a terrific example because we can play games with the financial products and financial systems so people can make money. It's been going on for a long time, and it'll continue to go on for a long time. The other thing is, okay, once I understand all this, then to your point, does that mean the government really owns housing?
Yeah.
Uh, does that mean does that mean that the government really subsidizes housing in this country?
Right.
And you'll you'll have the right-winged politician come up and say, we have to keep America non-socialist. We have to keep
Right.
America's free market pumping along. And in the next breath, raise the mortgage interest deduction.
All right, folks. And with that, we're going to have to put a
And
cap on it. We're at our
oh
first segment.
darn, we could really go.
John Ladley. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.